So the topic of my presentation is field notes in the context of native title and anthropology practice. And I'll be providing an introductory overview addressing different aspects of field notes. And as Wendy said, my colleagues Craig Elliott and Sarah Bell will follow with complementary perspectives. Craig will discuss his own field notes and what we can learn from historical examples that many of us rely upon. Sarah will elaborate on her own field note technique and the process of translating field notes into native title reports. And we'll have about 15 minutes, I think, for people to share their views and ask questions, comments. There's a really mixed audience here. Many of you, I'll be telling you how to suck eggs, and others are just starting out. Okay. First, however, I'm aware that some of you have not trained as anthropologists, and I want briefly to reflect upon the role of field notes in ethnography more broadly. And as we know, Malinowski was a pioneer of the participant observation methodology of fieldwork, and he stressed the importance of immersion in a society if one is to understand the customary beliefs, social organisation, and cultural practices. But while fieldwork is a hallmark of anthropology, the recording of anthropologists' observations in field notes is fundamental to the anthropological method. Anthropologists write ethnographies based on theoretical analysis of their field notes. However, this is not their only application. As Chambers comments in their Guide to Applied Anthropology, the special information gathering strategies associated with fieldwork have considerable value apart from their use in ethnography. As anthropologists engage in native title research, we use our primary data collected during fieldwork undertaken for a native title claim to write reports. Before turning to the specialist requirements of native title, I'll briefly reflect upon field note taking as part of the disciplinary training in anthropology historically. So, although field note taking is fundamental to the anthropological method, there's not been as much critical attention to the practice as one might expect. And in 1990, Roger Sanjek published a now classic book on fieldwork methods, in which he claimed that within the university setting, quote, anthropologists, past and present, have done a notoriously poor job of teaching how to do fieldwork and ethnography, end of quote. Anthropologists who contributed to Sanjek's volume observed that the practice of field note taking was shrouded in mystique and treated by some almost as part of the initiation rite of becoming an anthropologist. The anthropologist Jean E. Jackson interviewed 70 academic anthropologists about their approaches to field notes for her chapter, I Am a Field Note, Field Notes, a Symbol of Professional Identity. Jackson found that the subject of field notes was complex and disturbing for many people. In particular, she reported that the issue of sharing field notes was touchy, and many anthropologists she interviewed had not seen other people's field notes. Some interviewees felt inadequate, embarrassed, or anxious about their notes and were worried about feeling judged. Others were concerned about confidentiality and ethics, while some felt that their field notes recorded important information that should be deposited in an archive. Others felt that their field notes were a dialectic between themselves and the informants, and that they weren't simply a record that spoke for themselves. While Jackson noted an I did it my way individualistic streak amongst many anthropologists, others spoke of a patterned and disciplined approach and had shared their field notes with junior colleagues who worked in the same fieldwork area. While most interviewees hadn't received training in field note taking and were left to a sink or swim approach, many who did receive training complained about what they were taught. So can I have a show of hands as to who received formal training in fieldwork methods and field note taking in their anthropology degree? Okay, so less than a third, or about a third, I would say. Yeah, right. While surveying articles on the art of field notes for this presentation, I noted that although attention to field note taking has increased since Sanjek's book on the subject, much information is still directed towards anthropologists undertaking extended research for academic projects. Their fieldwork is likely to be more open-ended and less structured than that required for preparation of a native title claim report. Importantly, it's unlikely to be subject to the same kinds of forensic scrutiny directed at anthropologists involved in native title claims and other applied anthropology projects. So a starting point should be that your field notes are not privileged information. They can be accessible by third parties. Now, I'm not providing legal advice, but you should be aware they can be summoned in court and viewed during litigation. Anthropologists are accepted as expert witnesses in native title court cases and other administrative inquiries because it is recognised that anthropology is a distinctive discipline with a specialised field of expertise and a specific methodology. So, as Rummery observes, the anthropologist acts as a true expert witness, assisting the court in comprehending technical facts and evidence. It not only bridges critical gaps in understanding, but constructs the understanding required. Anthropology inquiry isolates and describes systematic structures and relationships and teases out complexity. Processes of social change and evolving tradition can be explained as part of a system of laws and customs dealing with historical events. So Rummery continues, the anthropologist engages in primary evidence gathering by using the ethnographic skills of observation, questioning, and recording, and the evidence is collated and rendered into forms that reflect the anthropologist's understanding of the relevant parts of tradition and custom to be proved. So what are some of the implications for field notes and data recording? So anthropologists' opinions in their reports must be supported by evidence based on logical underpinnings and a reliable methodology. And the weight given to opinion evidence is linked to problems of proof. What to include in field notes? Field note taking used in native title work will necessarily be guided by specific questions relevant to the task at hand and the need to supply information that can be relied upon as evidence by courts. While it's necessary to have a disciplined approach to produce quality field notes, this does not mean that field note is a paint-by-numbers information gathering exercise. So I've worked with many senior anthropologists and observed differences in approach. However, whatever one's approach, the notes must be fit for purpose. They are the text that one relies on, the data, to order information, constructs one analysis, and present the basis for one's understanding of and opinions of the relevant parts of Indigenous cultural traditions, laws, and customs to be proved. So over the years, I've seen field notes ranging from scratchy, indecipherable jottings, my own included, to detailed, informative notes with verbatim quotes. And at some points in our careers, many of us would have had the experience of writing scratchy notes and when reading them, wondering what they meant, why they were relevant, and who made a particular comment and the context. Okay. So this is just getting to some practical issues, looking at the core content. It's likely to include kind of header content and facts, which will have the date, time, location, place of observation, noting whatever the purpose is, whether it's a group discussion, a site visit, whatever. And then there's the facts to include. And as you can see, I won't read out all of these, but they do include identifying your informants, what's happening, roles of participants, observations on social dynamics and socio-spatial observations. Are there different views? Thinking about the anthropological basis for the different views, or at least noting things so you can think and reflect about it later. what's said and who said it. I can write field notes very fast. I try to capture verbatim quotes as much as possible rather than focusing on a summarized interpretation of what it is I think at the time someone's saying. And this can prove really helpful later on, even if you don't understand it. You can ask people about it to explain or elaborate. And later on, it may well be that there's something there that you didn't think was important at the time, which turns out to be very important. And this sort of takes account of the relational nature of Aboriginal knowledge as well, and epistemology in the way that people express things. It can be useful to number site visits according to the sequence in which they occur to match up with photos and assist with recall. Okay, so I won't have time to go through all the different kinds of things that one records while doing field work for a native title claim, but these are some things that one might include site visits based on the sorts of things I've done in Central Australia, Northern Territory and other places. So obviously date of visit, names of sites, the features, etc., informants, this kind of thing. Okay. Important considerations are gender-restricted information. It must be clearly indicated on the page, and if your field notes are subpoenaed, such material may need to be isolated and viewed appropriately. Now, you can have gender-specific information that isn't restricted, but it's also important to kind of note this as well and the protocols surrounding that, and this will be a useful guide also for lawyers or whatever. Okay. So now turn to consolidating notes and writing up. So established anthropological practice is to go over one's field notes at the end of the day and expand them as soon as possible. But while in the field, there's generally a lot going on and one can't record everything. Record things as they happen to the best of your ability and augment them with missing details as soon as possible. For example, one might add notes about context, observations on the significance of different views, and questions to follow up. And one should indicate that these observations are not contemporaneous. Some people do this with a different coloured pen, others do it using a particular way of framing or phrasing information. You need to bring the materials you've collected in a coherent way in order to generate a useful body of information. And you will have heard the maxim that every hour spent observing requires an additional hour to write up. Field notes should be of a quality to support the reliability of your report. And I don't know about many people in the room, but a lot of the field work I've done on the years, going back over 40 years, we haven't had the luxury of accommodation. I've often had to camp and not had sort of lighting at night, etc. So really encourage anyone as soon as they get back to add as many notes and etc. Audio recording and transcription. So with the advent of smartphones, it's now easy to record claim and comments in interviews on a phone, but it's important to transcribe the information as soon as possible. And if it's in an Aboriginal language, translate the content as soon as possible. In the case of a lengthy recording, note relevant excerpts, the recording date, time, context, and topic as soon as possible. And beware the trap of recording information and not going back to it and thinking it's there and not being in your notebook. When it comes to writing your native title report, references to transcriptions can be made using an abbreviation of your name together with the date of the interview, page number of transcription, and the name of speaker. So just bringing you to some examples of strong field note practice. I regard Nicholas Peterson's field note techniques as a gold standard. He wrote detailed notes in a field notebook which was labelled and numbered according to the project with which he was engaged. He left space in his handwritten field notes to insert photographs. At night, he would, depending on the situation, go over them and make additions, for example, noting observations on context. When Nick, of course, started out, a lot of the photographs, you had to develop them and then paste them in. And now it's so easy just to take multiple photographs. So and then you fall into the trap of not labeling them and figuring out which ones are actually really useful to your work. Okay. So to take another example, the Yinji-Banu compensation claim, Kingsley Palmer described his fieldwork method as follows. So he actually goes out first with a pro forma, asking certain questions to kind of tease out information and what might be useful and what informants want to follow up, etc. But he says, fieldwork data was written up from notes taken at the time of interview or observation. These were typed on a laptop computer, an activity I undertook as soon as possible after the event to ensure that I represented my data as accurately as possible. Consistent with my immediate recollections of the content of each event or interview, I sometimes modified my original notes in minor ways in the final notes. It is in this final version of my notes upon which I rely in this report. I cite them as KPFN plus the relevant page number of the notes and the names of the informant or interviews. And I've taken this extract actually from one of his Yinji-Banu reports, which is available on the web. I've got references at the end of this talk. So when citing his notes on informant statements, Kingsley said, sometimes he placed the words or statements made in inverted commas in the report, and he did this to reflect to the best of his recollection and consistent with the account made at the time of the interview, the words of the person with whom he spoke. So some cautions and legal scrutiny. As I mentioned earlier, a starting point should be that your field notes are not privileged information. In future years, they may be read by claimants or their descendants. Do not include embarrassing observations about the credibility of a witness, such as they are a know-nothing. Your observations about a person's knowledge may change over time, and your field notes may go on to have a life of their own, as indeed do the people who feature in them. And I mean, Australia was a classic example of an anthropologist who would make these sorts of comments about informants. And one of his informants was Wenton Rabunja, who he said was a know-nothing. And of course, he became, you know, a kind of very incredibly knowledgeable senior elder who was relied upon not only in Alice Springs, but in elsewhere in many land claims and native title claims, etc. Don't write about your own emotions. There's no place for speculation or generalizing. Translating field notes for native title report writing. So during the process of report writing, the facts or evidence noted in one's field notes must be collated and rendered into forms that reflect your understanding of the traditions and customs to be proved. Shifting from field notes to report writing involves organising information, analysis of traditions as they emerge from claimant statements, and reference statements back to field notes. This forms a basis of one's opinion. Different anthropologists have varied approaches to the subsequent treatment of the field notes. Some have detailed indexes, entries at the back of their notes that note page references for relevant themes. For example, the names of informants, sites, bases of recruitment, other content. Others type up, like Kingsley and myself, their field notes. Typing up one's field notes facilitates organisation according to topics, and it may involve the creation of other documents by cutting and pasting material, for example, creating site, registers and dreaming data, etc. So indexing information according to topics or themes is a form of coding, and it pays to reread field notes and not simply rely on coding when analysing matters and writing up reports. The anthropological approach is inductive, grounded, and attentive to context. The value of digital field notes is that they're easily searchable, and this is useful when one is at the pointy end of a report and has inadvertently neglected to footnote a personal communication, and you're thinking, now where was that, who said that, etc., easily searchable. So it's important to be able to note the source of the information on which you rely for your opinion. And in terms of primary field note data, sources may be referenced by identifying the speaker and then noting personal communication with yourself, together with the date and location of the interview. So, as I've indicated, field note taking is not simply about recording information, but it involves the interrelated practices of observation, listening, and asking questions. Clearly, if you don't ask questions relevant to the subject of inquiry, you're unlikely to have the kind of informative field notes on which to base sound analysis. While you'll have specific questions that provide focus and direction, be prepared to be flexible and follow where people constructively lead you in conversation. In my experience, people don't generally speak about things when you're doing field work with them if they think they're not relevant to the matter at hand. And as I said, I try to make a habit of recording people verbatim, and this has proved quite useful. Familiarise yourself with the language of the group or the groups you're working with. It will save time and misunderstanding if you get your ear in, so to speak, for the language. Master the accepted orthography for spelling words in language. And if you can't understand something, if it's quite different, language orthography that you might be used to, you'll find that today many middle-aged and younger people are actually can write in their language as well and will help you. Check terms in language dictionaries or at night if you don't have a dictionary with you when you're back in the office. So today, many people you consult are used to representative body or land council anthropologists and the nature of their work. But before you consult with people, do your homework, formulate the questions that you need to ask for the subject of your visit. And remember that our questions are shaped by our theoretical frameworks, whether we're conscious of it or not. And we can't eliminate our bias, but we need to recognise it. Always respect protocols surrounding gender-restricted information and be alert to avoidance strategies ranging from refusal to engage about particular things to subtle body language. Avoid asking leading questions. While the content of questions is important, so too is the form of the questions. The way they are phrased affects their usefulness or validity. So questions that just require a simple yes or no, leading questions, because they contain the answer that they suggest. Thank you, Wendy. Leading questions are challenged in court and are of limited usefulness. They can also involve what's called gratuitous concurrence. If a person is being questioned in a language in which they're not fluent, they may simply say yes based on partial understanding of the question. And the linguist Diana Eade has written extensively about this, as well as Michael Walsh and Harold Kopp. And a lot of their writings actually came out of the process of land claims and looking at the way that lawyers asked questions and the way that the answers were recorded. And so in the transcripts, I'm sure many of you have looked at transcripts from native title land claims, you'll see some really terrible faux pas. I remember in one claim I was in, the people were talking about Parenti and it was written down as brandy. They went out for brandy each day. Okay, so some concluding observations. So we work in demanding physical circumstances, floods, stolen cars, rain, fire, losing your field note off the bonnet of your car. Make sure you safeguard your field notes when working away from the office. So there's this, many of us have stories about anthropologists who had their field notes in a car or whatever and in one case, David Brooks had his PhD field notes in his car. The car was stolen and all his notes went. He was in the middle of writing it up. And then about a month later, he got a call from a woman who said she was driving through by a road by a field and saw all these field notes sort of flapping, all these paper flapping away. And she picked it up and realised it was someone's field notes. Anyway, she tracked him down and got it back. he actually ended up doing quite a different PhD, but that's beside the point. Okay. So just a final note on legacies of field notes. So in the 1960s and 70s, practice of fieldwork and representation of the other came under increasing critique, buoyed by the publication of Malinowski's Confessional Field Diaries, a diary in the strict sense of the term. And for many of you who are younger, you might not necessarily know, but this led to theoretical reflections on critiques of the fieldwork method. As Marcus and Fisher pointed out in the 1980s, Indigenous people with whom anthropologists undertake research became increasingly conscious of the way they have been represented in the anthropological record. And this is very much the reality today. People are cognizant of and questioning how anthropological research has informed negotiations and things like the codification of property relations. Many people with whom you work may have consulted not only field notes of earlier ethnographies such as Tyndale and Strelo and land claim reports, but also increasingly cultural heritage material returned to research participants or available at AAS. And the way field notes are recorded will shape people's understandings. So with that, I now turn to my colleague Craig, who will be elaborating further on these issues and what we can learn from his field notes and historical field notes. Thank you.